Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Wednesday, February 18th. I'm your host, Amanda Borschel-Dan, here in our Jerusalem studio with settlements reporter Jeremy Sharon and religions reporter Rossella Tercatin. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining me today.
Thank you. It's great to be here in this beautiful studio.
Thank you. And those of you who usually just listen, please check out our YouTube and Spotify videos. Jeremy, thanks for gracing us with your presence in our Jerusalem studio.
Absolutely. It's always good to be on the podcast and even more special to be in this brand new studio.
Well, welcome. And today we are going to discuss several topics, including Jeremy's new analysis of the de facto steps that our government is taking to annex the West Bank. Then we'll hear from Rossella and actually do a little bit of the time warp and go back to a 2017 government decision to create a permanent egalitarian prayer platform at the Western Wall. And then finally, we're going to hear what happens when Jesus Christ gets hungry. All of this and more when we're back.
בשם השף נעשה ונצליח.
אתם הטבחים חושבים שאתם מחזיקים את העולם בביצים. זה לא טוב לך מה שאתה עושה. מה אתה יודע מה טוב לי, מה לא טוב לי? סרוויס! לא יוצאת לי ממש. אתה שקרן. מה את רוצה ממני? חי.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our settlements reporter Jeremy Sharon and religions reporter Rossella Tercatin in our Jerusalem studio. Jeremy, we're going to start with you. And this morning we heard from Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who said that we should be taking all steps possible to encourage migration of Palestinians from the West Bank. This statement comes, of course, on top of the full cabinet decision on Sunday, which basically legislates the registration of land for Jews purchasing land in the West Bank. So there's so many different steps to put into this bucket of potential de facto annexation. And Jeremy, you have a great analysis, which should be published by the time this podcast goes out. So Jeremy, let's take us through a little bit of these steps towards de facto annexation.
Okay, so I just first want to mention those comments by Smotrich, which you brought up. And I think when he says, that in the next government, he wants to encourage Palestinian population out of the West Bank, I think that's really the only logical conclusion of all the steps that this current government has been taking in order to expand the settlement movement and to deepen and entrench Israeli control over the West Bank. Coming back to the specifics of what you've mentioned, earlier this month, there was a security cabinet decision which made it far easier for Israelis to purchase private property in the West Bank and also expanded Israeli enforcement authority in the West Bank against various Palestinian construction violations in Area A and B, where the Palestinians are meant to have full civil control, and in Areas A they're supposed to have full military and civil control as well. So that was one major decision. And then earlier this week, there was a decision to open up renew the land registry process for the West Bank. During the period of the British Mandate and the Jordanian control of the West Bank, about a third of land in the West Bank was registered. But that process stopped in 1967 when Israel took control after the Six-Day War. And that process was completely frozen. And now I should go back to May 2025 when a cabinet decision was made to begin the process to prepare the ground for the land registration process. And it's very instructive what Smotrich, who's the finance minister, but also critically a minister within the defense ministry, said then. And he said then this process is designed as part of efforts to assert sovereignty over the state. I'm using his explicit language, sovereignty, and sovereignty over the West Bank, and also in order to expand the settlement movement. Those were his explicit words. So
Just to pause 1 second, in terms of the expansion, Jeremy, in your piece, you have some hard numbers, and it's something, 69 new settlements since this government took office? Is that correct?
yeah, 69 new settlements, which is really unprecedented. It should be mentioned, not all of those are brand new. I think maybe 15 to 20 are brand new, which may not have even been established yet. Others are illegal outposts, which have been legalized, or, what was determined to be neighborhoods of settlements, which were actually 2, 3, 4 kilometers away from the mother settlement, but determined to be a neighborhood, and now have become a full settlement themselves. So 69 full new settlements. And then really a mushrooming of what's called illegal farming outposts over the West Bank. There's at least 120 of those, where there's a couple of families, and they have a herd of sheep or goats, and they send them out to pasture over large areas of land. Plus the appropriation of about 5,000 to 6,000 acres of land, which is also a record in the West Bank to be used as state land. And we can talk about state land a bit later, but state land is used for the public development purposes and overwhelmingly for Jewish settlements, and also just the expansion of the amount of housing units being approved and built. There's 50,000 under this government. At least 50,000 new housing units have been approved. So obviously we're seeing a massive expansion on the ground. And also, as we're discussing now, the administrative steps to further entrench Israeli control.
And none of this is done secretly or sneakily. It's all very overt. The finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, has pretty much laid out the plan step by step, and he's just ticking the boxes at this point. And there are those who say all of this is actually under Israeli authority, meaning Alan Baker, for example, who wrote an op-ed on our pages, and you quoted him in your piece. So what does he say? Well, first of all, say who he is and why we should listen to him to begin with.
Alan Baker is a former legal advisor to the Foreign Ministry. That's a very important and prominent position with a lot of influence. And he is also now head of the legal department of the Jerusalem Center for Strategic Affairs. And so he has a lot of legal expertise. And he kind of looked to a kind of very plain reading of the text, so to speak, saying that the Oslo Accords are still intact. The legal framework surrounding that is still there. And annexation is a formal step whereby, a state says formally and approves in legislation that is annexing a certain territory. And until that time, you cannot say that administrative measures such as opening a land registry, enabling easing the purchase of property rights, you can't say that constitutes any form of annexation. But there are prominent opinions, and in my opinion, persuasive opinions, which suggest that is kind of perhaps a too naive way of looking at things, because there's three key aspects of what is known technically in international as a belligerent occupation, which Israel is essentially conducting. It's never said this is a legal belligerent occupation, but it essentially abided by the rules of a belligerent occupation. And those are that it should be temporary, that the maintenance of the status quo and the conduct of the occupation be done for the benefit of the local population, meaning the pre-war population. And the administration be done by the military. Because if you have a civilian administration, then essentially, a civilian administration from the original country, from the mother country, essentially you're applying the same legal regime, and that itself is a form of annexation. What we're seeing from this government is that all three aspects of those aspects of belligerent occupation, in word and deed, are less and less comporting with those terms of belligerent occupation. So, in terms of being temporary, what Smotrich says, we're applying sovereignty. Okay, and he said, I've lost count of the amount of times he said we are doing this to make sure there is never a Palestinian state. The option, the alternative to Palestinian state is what is his vision of essentially annexation, and which is
encouraging migration.
As a commensurate part of asserting or applying Israeli sovereignty and annexing the territory. So it's less and less temporary. It's for the benefit of the local population. I talked about state land before. So in the last, 40 years, Israel has declared around about 1 million dunams of land in the West Bank to be state land. And then about 65% of that has been allocated for public use. Of that land, 99% has gone to for the use of Israeli settlements.
So you're talking about like what, for roads and for sewage?
Roads, infrastructure, actual construction of actual settlements, everything to do with the settlement enterprise. That's what this land has gone to. 1% has gone to Palestinians. So if you're talking about, using, maintaining the belligerent occupation in the benefit of the local population, that doesn't seem to be the case either. And in terms of, civilian or military control, there was a very, very important decision at the beginning of this government where I think at the beginning of February 2023, you see, the West Bank was basically until recently governed it still is to a certain extent, it's governed by the commander of the IDF Central Command. And he has the power to issue kind of military legislation governing the area. And there's also the civil administration, which is a department of the defense ministry, but is subordinate to the military, and that runs civilian affairs. Smotrich demanded, as part of his coalition agreement, that he become a minister within the defense ministry. Within that role, he set up what's called the settlement administration in the defense ministry, and then had sweeping powers from the civil administration transferred to this settlements administration, which is and the director of that settlements administration is subordinate to Smotrich. So what we really have is, to a large degree, a switching of military control to civilian control in the West Bank to a greater extent. I don't want to say necessarily in whole, but to a large extent, that power is now moved from the military to Jerusalem, to the Israeli government. And so, as I said, we're seeing that Israel is less and less controlling the West Bank, through the military, and more through, the civilian government through Smotrich and the defense ministry. So, and one expert I talked to said that annexation is not necessarily a formal declaration, that there's a red line drawn and this is now ours. It can also be determined by what happens on the ground and the essence of what's happening there. And in fact, the International Court of Justice, in a non-binding advisory opinion in 2024, also said that the permanent aspect of Israeli control in the West Bank, the non-temporary aspect of it, makes it seem like it is permanent and there is de facto annexation. So we're seeing more and more that the character of Israeli control of the West Bank is more and more permanent, looks like annexation, even if de jure in law that situation has not yet been reached.
Now, Rossella, what we call the West Bank at the newspaper, that is our style, we call it the West Bank. Many in the world call Judea and Samaria. And this is, of course, biblical Israel. So much of what happened in the Old Testament, as we call it, the Hebrew Bible, took place in these areas. And there are many sites still that are worth visiting there.
Absolutely.
And until now, basically, it has been under the control of the military. And it's been very frustrating for those of us who have written about archaeology to get any answers ever from the military.
Very true.
Sites. Yes. But you've been covering over the past years, I would say, this move to also make this under the more civil authorities, the Israel Antiquity Authority, which has control over every other archaeological site in the state of Israel. So tell us, where does it stand right now in terms of the legislation process?
Right. So they have the MK Amit Halevi from Likud has been spearheading this effort to actually pass a law to move the control over antiquities and archaeological sites and heritage sites under a civilian authority. Now, at the beginning, that was under the Israel Antiquities Authority. As you mentioned, the Israel Antiquities Authority essentially refused to cooperate, and so they decided their attempt is to create a new civilian body, and the law is going to be discussed by the Knesset plenum in the probably upcoming days and if not weeks for the first reading, and then it's going to need 2 more readings to pass into law. And what I think is very interesting is that in this cabinet decision from a few days ago about all the land legislation and all sorts of other things, one of the things that were mentioned is that Israel is going to they essentially announced that Israel is going to take control over protecting archaeological sites and other sites like water sources and everything. And this law, if it's passed in the near future before other laws on the topic, may really be the first time that Israel officially says this topic, this area in the West Bank is under Israeli civilian control. And this obviously would be unprecedented and very, very dramatic. And of course, one of the reasons that Alevi and he has a lot of support, obviously, in Otzma Yehudit and the far-right parties, they say, well, this is our heritage. These are, sites where, as you mentioned, biblical sites connected to Jewish history, so we should be managing it. Of course, then, critics say, well, there's a lot of other sites, and there are churches, there are mosques, there are sites connected to ancient civilizations there, and they coincidentally, our legislators seem a lot less interested in those sites, even though they do say, no, we're going to protect everything, and so on and so forth. But yes, this could really be, archaeology might be the first official annexation bill for the West Bank.
Right. And already today, there are many sites that are in the West Bank and governed by the Israelis. Most of these, of course, are in Area C, which, just to review for our listeners, Area A, Arab, Area B, both Area C. For me, I say Canaanite, and then we know it's for the Israeli government. In any case, and they are heavily visited. Tourists come to them. I'm talking about Qumran, for example, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Herodium, so many of these different sites. And so on the one hand, it could be a great opportunity for tourists to come in and, people who are taking pilgrimages to see these churches. In order to get there right now, it's very difficult for people to get to these sites that are under Palestinian control. So are you hearing that kind of buzz as well from outside of Israel, or is it mostly just, annexation?
I mean, there's a certain kind of let's say, tourists, like pilgrims, Jewish, Christian or certain Christian denominations that are definitely very interested and they feel very connected to the biblical heartland. But I think right now, also we have to remember I would say the vast majority of archaeologists here in Israel are very concerned. And in general, the academic world, including the world of archaeology, is generally hostile to Israel, as we are seeing in many other areas. And so they're very concerned about what this is going to mean for international ties, funding, cooperation, collaborations. And so I think right now there have been some sites, for example, Sebastia, that was the capital of the ancient kingdom of Israel, that partially sits in Area B, that essentially has been declared Israel public land, and they're developing a site, and there have been people excited about it, but also a lot of criticism. And EU diplomats recently visited, and the Palestinian, the inhabitants of the village and of the area are very concerned about their source of livelihood. The archaeological site was connected to their village. So we see, I would say for now, we see more pushback than excitement, except in certain sectors.
Let's go to a short break.
While Israeli reservists were serving, the financial reality at home began to change. Salaries were reduced or lost, businesses were forced to pause, expenses continued to pile up. That's why Latet has created a dedicated relief fund for families of reservists facing financial hardship because of the war. Over the next 6 months, Latet will provide monthly food and hygiene assistance to help families regain stability and return to everyday life. These families stood for all of us. Now it's our time to stand with them. Donate today.
I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan with our settlements reporter Jeremy Sharon and archaeology and religions reporter Rossella Tercatin. Now we're going to turn to a topic that actually all three of us have reported on over the years. We're doing a bit of the time warp. We're going back to 2016 circa, and we're talking about a government decision that was pushed through in order to create a permanent egalitarian prayer plaza abutting the Western Wall. And it's actually located within an archaeological park. And I had the great privilege of going there with recently deceased archaeologist Gabriel Barkai, and he explained the significance of this archaeological area. You can read about it on the Times of Israel. And in any case, I think it was, 2013 that Naftali Bennett, who was then the diaspora minister, created this temporary prayer platform that stands until today. And it has a bit of a feel of like bleachers, when you're going to go see a performance and they put up some temporary bleachers with rickety stairs and things of this nature. It has that feel to it, and it's been there ever since. And so, yes, you can pray in an egalitarian way at the Western Wall. However, the twist here is that some stones from the Western Wall fell in, 2018, and they were cleaned up and they were repaired. And there's a whole process that we wrote about, and you can see on the Times of Israel as well. But ever since then, that whole section of the prayer platform that allowed you to actually touch the wall has been closed off. So where do things stand right now? Why is it again in the news this week?
Absolutely. So first of all, it's important to say, as you said, this platform is in an archaeological site, which means it's not in the main Kotel Plaza. That when we all think of the Kotel, we think about that plaza, that part of the wall, that is essentially managed under strict Orthodox, I would even say ultra-Orthodox ruling and type of approach to Judaism. So this area is kind of like southern of it in a separate area. And what has happened is that services are held, but on the other hand, there are all these problems. You cannot touch the wall, all the things you mentioned. So what happened was that the government over the years as committed, and Prime Minister Netanyahu himself committed in 2016 to sort of like make the area proper, official, give it an official also standing and way of managing it. And at the same time, let's also remember that liberal Jewish movements like Masorti Israel and the Reform movement in Israel compromised as well, because they originally wanted to be able to pray egalitarian or in their way in the main Kotel Plaza like many other people. But what happened was that then in 2017, Netanyahu sort of like caved to ultra-Orthodox pressure. It's still committed, though, to kind of like repair and upgrade this area. And very little to nothing has happened ever since. So there have been hearings at the High Court of Justice, because the petitioners have been, which are these liberal groups and other groups as well, have been asking, let's do what what was promised. So after the last hearing in February 2023, yesterday was another hearing before the High Court of Justice, a panel of 7 judges to kind of like emphasize this is serious stuff. And essentially, I mean, the hearing yesterday was mostly for the justices to ask the state and the municipality of Jerusalem, what's happening? Why aren't these repairs? And in the case of, there is a smaller platform that really, as you said, is adjacent to the Kotel, to the Western Wall, so that people can touch it. And they said it would take just a few days, essentially, to reopen it and make it accessible again. And in 6 years, 7 more, they haven't done it. So they heard from both the state attorney and the municipality attorney what's happening. And essentially, they kind of like blame each other. They said, the government said, oh, yeah, we've been trying. We've been asking for permits. And the municipality said, oh, you didn't really communicate with us. It was, we only heard updates about the court. But the municipality also kind of said, because it's such a sensitive area, we want another cabinet approval, even though the cabinet had already approved this at this point, I would say 10 years ago. So we see that essentially, and this is also kind of like what court president Itzhak Amit said, was like the impression is that everyone is doing all they can to delay and drag their feet, and that's not acceptable. The court didn't issue a decision, although the petitioners do hope and expect that it will kind of like say, hey, government, your state, you have 30 days to fix this or to really move things forward, or something like that. I think it was interesting to see that in spite of the fact that the justices really try to focus on, we're not discussing the bigger issue here of what should be acceptable or what not. We are focusing on saying this was supposed to be done. Our government and state committed to it, has not been done. It needs to move forward. There were still like attorneys from the chief rabbinate and other Orthodox groups that have been involved, kind of like trying to say these are halachic, meaning Jewish law issues, and the court does not have jurisdiction over it, is not acceptable. And so I think, obviously all of this, like what lies behind all of this is that there are a lot of sensitivities over what is Judaism in this country, what is acceptable, what is sanctioned by the state and what not. And I think also just one final note, it's interesting because one could say this is a battle over Jews who want to keep traditional halacha, Jewish law, and Jews who just, halacha is not, Jewish law is not the way of approaching Judaism, but that's not the case because, for example, another group of petitioners, a group of individual women, most of them Orthodox or traditional, are asking to hold all-female prayer services in the main women's section at the Western Wall with the Torah scroll, which is something that at least some prominent Orthodox authorities would say that is acceptable under halacha, but is still not acceptable under those who manage the site.
There's so much to unpack here. And Jeremy, you remember, of course, covering this at a different publication a decade ago. And I just remember me myself reaching out and speaking with, the head of the reform movement and how jubilant he was when we heard this decision that there would be this imminent construction of a permanent prayer platform for egalitarian use. And I don't know, it was such a long process even getting to that decision, and involved Natan Sharansky. So much went into this. And so when you're here now as our legal reporter at the Times of Israel, I just wonder, what were you thinking when you heard that there is going to be this renewed hearing yesterday?
Well, it reminded me of what I like to call the good old days of kind of sectarian strife between Jewish denominations, as opposed to Middle East geopolitical conflict and war. What was I thinking? It's so hard to see a way through on this. I'm not sure even if the court, especially in its current constellation, will really take the bull by the horns. I think it's a sad situation because it's something which would really help help Israel reach out to the Jewish diaspora in a certain way. Not that I think it's necessarily a critical issue like it's been portrayed, but I think it is something which would be a nice gesture. And at the end of the day, I think it's also an important aspect of equality before the law in Israel, that all Jewish denominations have access to the Kotel. And, this talk about when the municipality lawyers are arguing with the state lawyers about this permit, and if access to the prayer site in the main part of the Kotel Plaza was damaged, it would have been fixed yesterday, not.
And that indeed happened. If you remember, a stone did crumble there as well.
Exactly. So, I think it is a sad situation, and we'll see. Maybe the court does come up with some order specifically saying, it's unacceptable that this thing has not been repaired after 7 years. It's literally a couple of planks of wood which would damaged by the falling stones, and they haven't been repaired for 7 years. So maybe the court will come up with something like that. I don't think the court will address the broader issue because I think it will see that that's beyond its remit, especially when the court has clashed in so many different other areas on really critical aspects of the clash of the branches of power in Israel. So I think that's probably as much as can be expected at the moment. There is one other issue which I've also followed, which is the issue of women reading from the Torah in the main section, in the women's section of the main section of the Kotel Plaza. And there, the chief, the rabbi of the Western Wall, Shmuel Robinovich, has kind of carved out some kind of ex-territoria where he bans, under his authority, he bans women's groups who want to pray in a minyan from using one of the Sifrei Torah belonging to the Western Wall Heritage Foundation, but also bans them from bringing in their own Sifrei Torah to read. So they're kind of stuck, and they've often having to kind of smuggle in small Sifrei Torah and so on. Maybe something will come of that, because that's also kind of a very unhappy situation.
It really did feel like we were going back in time. But Rossella, let's go back even further in time and hit an area very close to where we were just talking about. And let's talk about Jesus's visit to the Temple Mount, in which he was very angry and he threw over money changers' tables. And it was just a very stark and a much quoted scene called The Cleansing of the Temple. And there's a new reading of this in the article that you recently worked on. So tell us, what is this new reading?
Yes. So this article, this peer-reviewed article, written by three scholars from different universities, including an Israeli, Hagai Olshanesky, who is researching at the University of Varsavia of Warsaw at the moment. So essentially, they are reading the text very, very closely, putting together some elements in the text and also some sort of like archaeological elements and general knowledge about the time. And they're saying, most people have interpreted this scene as Jesus's harsh critics toward the Jewish system, the leadership, and so on and so forth. And maybe we should just look at what he was experiencing as a human being there. Because, as he said, even in Christianity, the idea is that Jesus had a divine side and a human side. And academics and clergy has always focused on the divine side in this episode. But what is really, it was just hungry and human, and as he said, maybe a bit short. So essentially, this episode appears in all the 4 Gospels. The one that is the most elaborate about it is probably Mark, and that's also where a lot of the interpretation comes from. So essentially, they say Jesus and his followers arrive in Jerusalem. The Gospel of Mark tells us they go to the temple at night. They don't find anything. They go and spend the night just outside Jerusalem in Bethany, Mount of Olives. And then the following day, we know that Jesus was hungry because he sees a fig tree and it's not the season, and he curses the tree as if it's not the tree's fault. And then they go back to the Temple Mount and there's this scene. So he's saying, what if he was hungry and they came from the Galilee, a long journey. They needed to change the money into local currency. They don't find money changers at night, so they cannot buy food. So then he wants to go back, and then what might have caused him such a rage? And it's also important to say that another important element is that if really there was such a big scene and also these problems, the authorities there would have noticed it and would have immediately taken measures against him, arrest him, expel him. And since we know that they were kind of like looking for him, maybe he would have been already arrested, trialed, and executed earlier than, when he was. So they're saying maybe it was a much more limited episode. Maybe he was trying to change a coin and he felt he was cheated on a number of a silver coin, a number of like bronze coins that he was given. And what he said also, if we look at Jewish sources, which obviously a lot of like Christian and academics don't, the Mishnah, for example, from the time, there's a lot about changing money and problems of exchange values and so on and so forth. So maybe he felt he was sort of like cheated. So he didn't like get upset at everyone, just at the very specific person he was dealing with. And he felt he was in a way robbed. And then why he used the terms a den of robbers to describe the temple. And maybe he wasn't making a bigger statement also because ultimately we know that Jesus was a Jewish man trying to go up to the temple to sacrifice an animal to God, as every Jewish man in that period would want to do ahead of Passover. And maybe that's what we should consider. And I think it's I really kind of like picture the scene in my head, as we talk about now, like the kotel at night, there's no one around, not even a falafel stand open, come on. And then I go back and there's, a lot of things, but I'm already kind of like upset and maybe it's hot. And so I think there's something very interesting to really maybe look at, obviously for Christians, Jesus is something else, but even for us to kind of like look at this experience through our eyes and what it must have meant.
It just made me think of what my mom always said to me when I would come home from school very cranky. She would say, drink a glass of milk and then talk with me. And it's so true. When you're hangry, there's nothing you can do.
Nothing you can do, even if you're Jesus.
Even if you're Jesus, right. All right, Jeremy, Rossella, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Good to be with you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another episode tomorrow. This installment was produced by Ari Schlacht. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.